Hey there, and welcome back to the Fuse Show. Today I'm joined by Bharath Krishnamoorthy. He's a lawyer and venture backed entrepreneur. Together with his high school best friend, Shawn Vo, they formed Axle, a carrier payments and factoring platform for freight brokers. As a CEO, his goals include attracting a diverse team of highly talented and highly motivated individuals and building a workplace environment that allows them to thrive. In addition to work with Axel, he serves as a board advisor to the James Madison University's Center for Entrepreneurship. Thanks for joining us on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David.
So I've noticed that your history is one that's rather uncommon. One from going from a pursuing a JD to starting a finance platform. Could you tell me about that journey?
Yeah, um, I think like a lot of people's, it kind of goes all over the place. For me personally, uh, I think the reason I wound up here is my co-founder Sean and I have been starting businesses together for a very long time. Like 10, 15 years since we were in high school.
Hmm.
Uh, so there was a part of me that always wanted to do this, to like start something and make this our full-time jobs, right? And just build something awesome with Sean. Uh, but it's also a little bit intimidating. Like, how do you go about doing that? And so, after high school, we both went to college. He got a job working in fintech. I ended up going to law school in New York, and then I practiced for a little bit after that. And while I was practicing in New York, um, I was just like, man, I can't do this. Like, this is not what I want to be doing for my entire life. I'd way rather be building something dope with Sean. And I think Sean was having sort of a similar experience, which is like,
Hmm.
working at a tech startup is a lot of fun, but it's he wanted to like build something, right? He wanted to like put himself in the arena and see what he could make happen. And so we got to talking. We came up with this idea in 2017 to do revenue optimization for intercity bus companies. So super obscure industry, uh, but a real problem for them. And so we quit our jobs and we went and we started this pricing optimization solution for the bus industry. And uh, you know, we got it up and running in the first like 5 6 months. It was doing about 100 grand a year in annualized revenue. But we realized pretty quickly that the market opportunity there was just like totally capped. And so for the next 2 years, we were just pivoting around, trying to find something that was, something that we were really interested in, something that we believed we would be better than other people at, and something that is just made a lot of sense from a business opportunity perspective. And we wound up here with Axel in mid 2019.
So did you say you've been wanting to create businesses with your business partner since the high school days? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we did all kinds of stuff when we were younger, but this is the first time that we did something like real, in the sense that it wasn't like a side hustle, right? This is like what we do, and we wake up in the mornings, we're thinking about all day. We're able to like hire employees, we're able to pay for ourselves to live, that kind of thing.
How'd you go from studying law into wanting to optimize revenue for transportation in cities?
Yeah. So like I said, we were really looking for, that first time was just like, what is something we could do that seems like there's market opportunity. And at the time, Sean and I were both living in New York. Uh, our parents are both in like the Northern Virginia area, and we were taking these buses back and forth all the time. And we noticed that it doesn't seem like they're priced very efficiently, right? Sometimes you're on the bus, it's totally packed, but the prices were super cheap. Other times you're on the bus and it's totally empty and the prices were more expensive. And it seems like, there's something left on the table there.
Right.
So we started talking to a lot of these people, and we realized like, yeah, they're just like totally winging it. So we set out to basically build a more simplified version of the type of tools that the airline industry uses, right, to do
Hmm.
their scheduling, and it's a little bit more simplified and it's adapted to this specific mode of transportation. And there was, I think, a real need for that. So we were able to sort of get that up and running.
Is there a specific moment where you realize that, hey, like there's a cap to this? Like, was there a aha moment that you realized there's a better opportunity elsewhere, or do you always know that this is just your first shot into entrepreneurship and you just want to make the most of it?
We, I mean, I think initially it seemed like the opportunity was a lot bigger, right? And I think the aha moment was like, we had the one venture-backed bus company in the country as our customer, right? They're growing super fast. They're a great customer, but they were like the vast majority of our revenues, right? And we realized like, okay, if we just like market size this, right? If instead of looking top down at like, here's all the money that's spent on that, if we look at specifically the types of companies that we think are likely to pay for this service, there's really only like 50 of them. And, how much money do they make? And we take, a couple percentage points on that revenue. If we totally knock this out the park, maybe we make like $1 million a year, which is good money, but it's not a great best case scenario, right? For both of us, like taking a lot of personal risk, pouring our heart and soul into it. You're working just as hard to build the company, whether it's $1 million cap or $1 billion cap. And so we figured like, if we're going to grind like this, we want to make sure we find something that's worthwhile that we can really pour our time into.
So you went from doing bus pricing optimization into Axle. What were the intermediary steps between the two?
Yeah, there was a lot. So we ended up going through Techstars with that initial product. We got into Techstars, pivoted like a couple weeks into the program, spent basically the whole program trying to figure out what we were pivoting into and where we wound up, which I think was like an interesting problem area, maybe not the optimal solution, is that pricing and scheduling for these bus companies is like sort of a marginal optimization on the current solution, right? You can make it a little bit more efficient,
right?
You can times a little bit better, you can price it a little bit better, but you're not like totally changing the way that people travel. But if you could solve the routing problem, you could potentially create a lot more value, right? So for example, Shawn and I were trying to get to Northern Virginia, the bus only goes to DC. So like that trip is actually way longer than it should be, right? You have to like get to the bus, you take the bus to DC, and then you take a car down to Virginia. But if you could understand where are people moving at any given time up and down the Northeast corridor, you could potentially create these new routes based on that real-time demand to get people there more efficiently. So we actually ended up raising money on that first idea, or I guess on the second idea. And without getting too into weeds, there's a bunch of different reasons that solution doesn't actually work out in practice the way that we had hoped. And so we kept pivoting around from there, right? And the general theme is that we were looking at ways to solve long distance transportation to make it better than what it is right now. Right now, you basically have to have a car to travel in America.
Right.
But a couple of learnings along the way is that some of these ideas were clearly like they spoke to us more. They were more compelling to us personally, and we cared about them more, right? And when you care a lot about what you're trying to solve, it makes it a lot easier to put up with all the bullshit that you face as you're going through it, right? And some of them were like that, and some of them weren't. So one of the learnings was like, all right, we need to make sure that whatever we land on is something that we are excited to do every day and can like wake up every morning for the next 10 years and work on this thing. And another learning is that at the time we basically built the financial model whenever we were going out to raise money. And that was a bad approach because the financial model is not really for the investor, right? It's for you to understand the business. The investor wants to see it too, but you need to make sure that this business makes sense. A lot of these business ideas, they sounded cool in theory, but when you like really put together this financial model, it doesn't make sense as a business, right? And so one of the learnings was like, all right, let's not wait to get 2-3 months into the idea before we sort of like test the economics at scale. Let's like do that in this initial validation stage, right? And so then there was a couple of different learnings like this along the way that I think eventually helped us narrow on to what we wanted, right? We knew we wanted to do something broadly in the transportation space. We had met a bunch of different like founders and investors in the space. We had a good network in it. We knew it was interesting. We had realized that the freight transportation side of it was a lot more interesting from a business perspective, right? There's just way more dollars flowing through that ecosystem, and the bar for technology is so low. So there's room to add value. So we were kind of drawn to that area, and then freight finance in particular was appealing because it played to our strengths, right? Shawn has a background in financial technology. I was a lawyer, largely working for financial institutions, and the pain point was just super compelling, right? We're literally solving like cash flow problems are, one of the, if not the most salient problem that a small business owner faces, right? When you're just not able to pay bills.
Hmm.
And the idea of solving that problem for hundreds or thousands of other businesses, that's really compelling, right? That's something that's exciting to go and tackle that problem. Uh, so it was just sort of this like perfect mix of all the things we were looking for, right? Great business opportunity. There's, it's a massive market, highly fragmented. The incumbents have very low net promoter scores and are notoriously low tech. So
Hmm.
there's an opportunity for us to come in and build something that can sort of consolidate that space and deliver more value to our clients than the competitors could. And so that's sort of how we're drawn to it.
At the time you were applying to Techstars, did you have um, companies that like freight companies you were working with, or did that come after working with Techstars?
Yeah, it was like a year or so after Techstars in terms of like freight companies that we worked with in a business sense, right? Through
Gotcha.
Techstars, we met a lot of other founders and investors who were involved in freight tech, and that's sort of how we learned about it, right? Because freight is not an industry that Shawn or I knew a lot about before we had sort of got on this journey, but through that process, we ended up learning a lot more than probably ever would have expected to.
Was it scary for you to completely shift domains?
Yeah, I mean, it's scary, but it's not as scary as quitting your job, right? Like once you're in, you're sort of pivoting until you find it. I think the part that was scariest is that we had raised money in between these pivots, right? And so like when you're pivoting in the beginning, it's just like me and Sean, we're like, oh shit, we're gonna pivot. And once you've raised all this money, now it's like, man, we got to call these investors and explain that, like, hey, you guys backed us to do this thing, and we're actually going to do something totally different. And so every time we have to do that, that was pretty scary. I think we got really lucky, right? The investors that we brought in our pre-seed round they're all very cool, and they get it, right? They know how startups work, and they know that a lot of startup founders go through this process of like iterating before they land on something. And so they were way more supportive of this than I would have expected going into this process. Like every time I was calling them, I was like freaking out, sweating bullets. But they were all really cool about it, and I think in hindsight, I think it worked out well for everyone. Right? We're now, I think, have found product market fit. We're growing really quickly, and all of our original investors are still investors in this company, even though it was we're working on something totally different when they backed us.
Did you find these investors through Techstars, or did you find them on your own, or like how'd you come across these people?
Yeah, that's a good question. It is a little bit of both, right? So Techstars has like a demo day at the end of the program. I think most accelerators do.
Mhm.
I'm not sure how they do that in the post-COVID world, but that worked out well for us, right? Uh, we basically spent those whole 3 months like figuring out what this next business was, and so uh, we've been thinking a lot about that pitch basically throughout that time, and so we gave a great pitch, and there's a lot of investors in the audience who were really interested in it. So we set up time. I'd say about half of the round came together from people that were affiliated through Techstars, and then the other half were other investors that we had just met over the course of this past year or so who had been tracking our progress, right? And who uh, I think what was interesting with that second half is they saw that we had been pivoting, and I think they liked the approach we had taken rather than whatever idea we had at the moment, right? And they were really taking a bet on us.
Earlier, you're mentioning how the market you're trying to go after is the fragmented market of freight transportation. So once
Yeah.
you've identified that niche, how do you figure out the individuals that were worth reaching out to in that niche? Especially when you're in the early days, you can't. Oh, maybe you choose to take on a bunch of small clients, but at some point you do need to scale upwards in terms of size.
Yeah. So I guess taking a little step back, right? Some context about the market. In the logistics space, you have three key segments, right? You've got carriers on one end, which are the actual trucking companies that are getting paid to haul freight from place to place. On the other end, you have shippers, which are the end customers, right? So these are companies like Target or Walmart that are paying to have their freight moved. And then in between, you have 200,000 freight intermediaries, right? So that's freight brokers, freight forwarders, 3PLs. And these companies perform a market making function of connecting carriers with excess capacity to shippers with excess demand.
Hmm.
The factoring companies, right, which are the lenders in this space, have almost exclusively focused on financing the carriers for decades, right? So our thesis going in is that there's an opportunity to build a solution that serves these freight intermediaries, right? That we can leverage new technology to basically service them in a way that's safer than it has been in the past, which will allow us to do it, right? And before it wasn't that safe, and so factors weren't really servicing them. That was the hypothesis, right, going in. I think one of the things that really drew us into the space is when the way we validated that initially, right, was we literally just started cold calling and cold emailing anyone in the space, right? People who have started factoring companies, people who have sold factoring companies, senior executives at factoring companies, people that work in the logistics space, carriers, brokers, right? And we heard a lot of different people basically say like, yeah, I think that's a real problem. I think if you could solve that, that would be really cool. And we had an idea about how to solve it. And then one of the companies we called was a freight intermediary, and he was like, hey, I need this right now, actually, right? Like, I'll be your first customer. We're like, wow, that was really easy. Like, we hadn't even, we didn't even get around to put on like a contract. We don't have anything to sell him. But, we sort of rushed it together to put the product together for him. And he's still one of our customers, and he's been a great customer to this day.
When you said that he wanted to be a customer, did you know what the price point was going to be, or would you just take him on as a freebie for being customer number one?
We came up with the price, and it worked. I think maybe we could have priced it higher, but at the end of the day, it's not so much the revenue from that one deal that was made, as to like, because now we had volume flowing through the system, we could actually build the system around it. We got to learn like how does this actually work in practice. There's a lot of value we got out of that, and because we generate revenue as the business grows, we were fortunate that his business has grown considerably over the past couple of years. And so we have ultimately ended up making, a good amount of money on it. And I think we've provided a lot of value to him as well.
So how many cold calls, or how many people do you think you've like talked to in those early days, if you can like just ballpark a number?
In terms of like actual conversations, probably like 20, 25 conversations. But in terms of like how much outreach, that's like hundreds of LinkedIn messages going out. Get people set up.
Are there things you've learned in the process that you wish you knew from the very beginning as it relates to customer discovery?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough, right? Because these are things that like I think most people who are trying to start a company will read these books about like how to do customer discovery. And the things that I wish I knew are the things that I read in those books. You just don't really appreciate it until you're doing it, right? There's so much of the advice centers around like how to not deceive yourself. And so that going in, like I'm going to try to structure these questions a certain way so that I'm not leading them to the answer that I want, because that defeats the whole purpose. But then you still do it anyways, right? So like I think it takes a little while to like actually do these exercises and figure out like, this is what I'm doing wrong, this is what's working well, and figuring out how to do that properly. But I guess like to summarize it, the thing that I think, if you were starting a company to keep in mind is to just be really careful that you're not deceiving yourself, right? Because you're so optimistic about it. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't have quit your job to work on this. And you care a lot about it and you're excited about this idea. So you're just going to be naturally inclined to like over perceive the supporting evidence and kind of ignore the evidence that contradicts you. And you just have to be really careful about that.
Earlier, you mentioned how you want to build a solution that was less risky and better suited for the fragmented market of many people in the middle, the matchmakers, if you will. And when you mentioned risk, you're talking about like financial modeling risk. Is that right?
So it's a little bit different, right? So when you lend money to a business, the lender will take a lien on that asset, right? On one of their assets, some subset of their assets. It basically means like if this company goes bankrupt, this lender is entitled to receive those assets, right? And that's how they protect themselves. So factors, these companies that buy invoices, the reason that logistics is a huge market for them, but the reason that they will only touch the carriers and not the brokers is because it's very difficult to get a first lien position on the broker's invoice.
I see.
And that's the statute that it covers, across the whole United States, that basically provides carriers a first position lien on their brokers' invoices.
I see.
So from the lender's perspective, if you lend money to a freight broker and they use that money to like whatever, pay their sales reps or cover some other business expense, other than paying the carrier who actually hauled the load, now you are out of luck because that carrier still has a lien, which supersedes your own. So
Right.
you're no longer in this position. And that's a really tricky thing to, that's a lot of exposure that factors aren't willing to take on. What we've done is designed our product so that when we buy the invoice from the broker, we also immediately pay out the carrier in full, right? Because it's all done digitally. So we have the carriers on our platform, we get their payment information, and we just send those payments out right away. So that extinguishes their lien and puts us in first position. So now we can treat this broker factoring the way that like factors treat every other customer segment, right? We don't have to worry about that additional risk.
And that, I'm assuming you've done the numbers to make sure it plays out at scale.
Yeah, it's and I would say that's like you're asking like advice for someone going through customer discovery. It's not exactly customer discovery advice, but I think one of my biggest learnings from this whole process is like you should model this stuff out in the beginning to see like what does this look like? Does it actually make sense to pursue this? And so we did do that, and the economics are actually very attractive because it's such an underserved customer segment. The economics are much more attractive than if we were going after the primary customer segment.
I see. And have you had scenarios where you had to actually like execute on that lien?
We have not had to go to like bankruptcy court or anything to recover, but we've had a couple instances where we've had like risk of loss and the risk mitigation procedures we put in place have allowed us to basically protect against that.
I guess the question I'm trying to get to is the fact that like I think at some level you're kind of like an insurance company, right? Where you kind of hope that most people will have like perfectly fine settlements where nothing goes wrong and you get the money just slightly delayed, but with your interest or your percentage of the cut. But how do you know that the pricing model you chose is appropriate for scale as opposed to underpricing and then finding yourself caught down the line?
Yeah, that's a good question. And that's actually a really good question because that exact problem has happened to so many fintech lenders where they're growing super quick because they're pricing their loans really cheaply. And so they're getting that nice up into the right curve and VCs keep putting in money.
Right.
And then a couple of years down, they find out like, wow, this is all bad debt. Like we thought our portfolio was worth, $100 million. It's really worth like 20 million. And then, the valuation plummets and everyone kind of freaks out. What's nice about what we're doing, which about the segment we're going after, which sort of avoids that risk, is that these invoices turn in 30 days, right? So we buy that invoice, we're going to get paid back in 30 days. So unlike someone who's, let's say, making like 4 or 5 year loans, where you could go 2 or 3 years in and not know if a single one of those are going to pay back.
I see.
Our whole portfolio gets paid back every month, right? So we now have over like 24 months of data where we made all these loans, everything got paid back. We made all these loans, everything got paid back. Cumulatively, throughout all of this time, our loss rate is 5 basis points, right? So 0.05%, which is a full order of magnitude better than the industry standard, right? So we feel very confident that what we're doing is working, right? There's a lot of data backing up that like, yes, this is safe, the economics are working out really well, but it's a risk-based product, right? And that's the case. It's like you can always have a bad month in the future, but we know that whatever it is limited to whatever we bought that month. All the stuff we've already purchased in previous months has already been paid back.
So as it relates to all risk-based product, there's almost always some sort of like credit modeling system. And I imagine there's an existing system, but you also build out an internal version of a credit system that you think might be more accurate in predicting payback behavior that doesn't necessarily correlate with an external number.
Yeah, so we model, like when we're looking at our forward-looking projection, we model in losses. So we're like expecting losses every month, even though in reality, we're just like not having them. Like we haven't had a loss in over 12. Basically, since we hired our head of operations, we have not had a single loss, right? So like real world, do I expect that we're going to lose money next month? No, I don't think so. But we model in that loss anyways at sort of the industry standard because we want to know that even if we did lose money at the rate that the industry was losing money, would the economics all still make sense? Would this still be a very profitable business? And the answer is yes.
I noticed that on the business on your business website, you have at the bottom of the page like a link that leads to your API. At what stage do you realize that you want to build this out into something that other people can hook into your API?
So my co-founder Shawn actually had this idea pretty early on, but we didn't put it into practice until like end of last year, right? And basically, the approach we're taking is that there's like in the freight technology space, it's so fragmented, right? Almost just like the actual freight space. There's so many different TMSs and different software providers that are tackling different parts of the value chain. And for a lot of them, I think it's clear like, oh, one way we can add even more value to our clients is by providing financing, right? We know that they want it. That's something we can do. We're in a position to get that capital.
Hmm.
Our direct competitors are very like old school companies that are very difficult to integrate with. So the bet we're making is that by taking this open API approach, right, and building like a really easy to use API and providing robust documentation, we can become the partner of choice for all of these other companies. So when they say like, yes, we want to provide financing to our clients, they can either go and try to create an entire factoring business from scratch, right, which is very difficult and involves a lot of competencies that they probably don't already have in-house, or they can integrate with our API, which is very simple and relies purely on competencies they already have in-house. And then they can provide that value directly to their clients. And then from our perspective, all of these other partners, all these other companies, instead of becoming potential competitors, now become channels through which we can access the end customer.
And in this process, do you find that do you find any competition in this process? Because I feel like you do seem to describe a pretty sweet spot in terms of you are better than the industry in a lot of ways, but are you either struggling to convince people to switch over, or are there other competitors that try to do something similar to your company?
Yeah, there's one company in particular, TriumphPay, which is basically a subsidiary of Triumph, like this larger, a bank, right? They're actually a real bank, and they're probably the one real company that's also going after this space. And they do have a serious advantage in terms of the fact that their cost of capital is just much lower, right? Like you have to lend the money out at
Right.
a rate that's higher than the money you're at the rate you're borrowing it, and they're borrowing at a much lower rate than ours. So like that's just sort of the market that we're entering. But the flip side of that is that so much of the value in this space, we're able to deliver through the technology, right? So the cost of capital doesn't matter when you're looking at like, we can automate their carrier payments, their invoicing, their collections, their book reconciliation, right? All this workflow automation we're able to provide, and we're able to build that out faster because we're a tech company at the core, right? And we've more than half of our budget is going to the engineering department. We're pushing out new features as quickly as we can. And so I think the reason that we've been able to pull so many clients away from all of these other competitors is because of the value we're delivering through the software, right? Sort of in spite of the fact that we're often charging a higher fee.
What's the friction level like for someone to convert from, I guess, another company to yours?
It actually depends entirely on how much of a pain the other company wants to
Okay.
be. So there's because of the situation where you have liens on the company's assets, we can't just like take them over. We need to get that first position lien, which means the other company needs to release their lien. So there's like a back and forth process. Most of the factoring companies, in the country are pretty good about it because they know like you're going to take their client today, but later they're going to take someone else's client, and it's better for everyone if there's a liquid market. But there are some bad actors who are just a real pain to work with. So I guess to answer your question, it varies. Sometimes it's pretty smooth. Sometimes it can be kind of a pain.
And just before this, you were mentioning how a good chunk of your money goes towards fueling your engineering team. How many engineers do you have currently?
We've got we've got 6 people right now on the product and engineering team, and we're hiring for 2 more at the moment.
How do you find them, or how are you actively finding more?
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one. So Shawn has sort of led the recruiting on that side. Um, we've used external recruiters. We've worked with people that Shawn has worked with in some capacity in the past, and we're starting to do a lot of our own outbound sourcing. But finding engineers is, it's not just a cliche. It's a very tough part of the job. I think what's cool, right, is that compared to most tech companies. Ours is a little bit different in that we're building our core platform on Elixir, which is a functional programming language.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of engineers who really like that, and they want to find a company that's building product in Elixir, right? And we're not the only ones, right? Like Brex does it, American Express's product is in it. A lot of the like sort of cutting edge fintechs are built on Elixir, but it is definitely a tiny minority of companies. And I think that helps us attract good talent.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the sales side, is it primarily you and your co-founder, or is it primarily you and who's in the sales team currently?
Yeah, so we actually hired our VP of sales last year, Tyler Ford, and he's been amazing, right? When it was just me doing sales, that was like okay, because it was just me trying to close these deals, right? But in terms of like managing other salespeople and coaching them and getting these processes in place, like I have no idea how to do that, right? And Kyler stepped in and has just completely taken that over. So he's, he takes over sort of managing the sales team, but also recruiting and building out the team, training them. So now we've got, I want to say like 6 sales reps on the team, all reporting into Kyler. And then we have a head of marketing, Mimi, who's also done a phenomenal job of getting the brand out there and making our name known to our customer segment.
So as the CEO, how do you decide whether to invest more into sales or invest more into engineering for any given like quarter or year?
So for us, we've actually, it's, I can see how in some companies it's like, oh, we have, $10,000, do we put it here or there? Because we've been pretty fortunate in being able to access the venture capital markets, our situation has been different where we have enough capital to hire both another engineer and another sales rep. The question is just how quickly can we find a good engineer to bring on, right? Or find a good sales rep to bring on. We try to be really selective about the talent we bring on because fundamentally that is like almost the only thing that matters, right? If we find really, really great people and we make them really happy to work here and we provide them a platform to do their best work, then everything else kind of takes care of itself. So the limiting factor has just been finding that talent, right? Finding people that we want to bring onto the team. We've been fortunate that it has not yet been a question of like, we only have money for one or the other side.
Okay. And then prior to this show, you shared with me an article from the Wait But Why blog titled "The Tail End." It's also it is my favorite blog post on that blog. Is there a favorite takeaway that you have from that article yourself? And for our listeners, we'll have the link on the landing page.
Yeah, you should call your parents every day. That's my big takeaway.
Okay. Are there challenges that as a CEO that you feel like make it harder for you to spend time with your loved ones?
There are times, right? Like, we had this huge family reunion a couple years ago. It's probably the biggest family reunion that my mom's side of the family has had, at least since I've been born. And I missed it because we were fundraising and I had to go fundraise. So that sucks. But then it's also like there's a lot of flexibility in the job in the sense that like, yes, I have to work a lot, but I can work from wherever, and this was true even before the company went, before the rest of the world went remote. So for example, last weekend, or 2 weekends ago, we threw a party for my little sister for getting into med school at my parents' house in Virginia. And me and my fiance were able to go down a week early and then stay a week late. And, I had to work obviously, but I was able to spend a lot of time with my parents because of that flexibility. So I think there's just trade-offs, right? It's definitely you're working a lot of hours, but you can structure it in a way that you can still spend a lot of time with the people you care about.
What would you say is the hardest part of your current role?
The hardest part of my current role. I would say the hardest part is right now there are a lot of individual spending decisions which are rolling up to us, which is like, hey, should we spend $10,000 on this, on this marketing project? And we're in a position where we have a lot of cash in the bank account. So it's like we could say yes to all of those and it's not going to break the bank, right? But that doesn't mean that's a good idea to say yes to all of those things. So figuring out how to like intelligently invest that capital over this next 2-year horizon is the challenge that I'm like most focused on. It's cool. It's nice to know it's a solvable problem, right? Like every other successful startup founder has solved this problem, and so I think by talking to these people, I can sort of understand how they did it. And it's an interesting challenge, but I think that's the one that I'm thinking about the most.
So how do you quickly adapt to all these different domains that you previously didn't at least directly work in, as it relates to like growing a company?
Yeah, you got to do a lot of Google searching and Google searching, and then talking to other founders. I think is the two biggest things. Uh, it's intimidating sometimes when you're like, well, now we got to figure out PR. How do we do PR? I have no idea. But then I try to take a step back, and it's like, look, so many other people have already done this before me, right? They've figured it out, and a lot of these people figured it out without the internet, right? So now I can just Google these things, and so it's that puts it in perspective, makes it seem a lot easier.
And when you're going about that journey, do you ever feel like there's a time where your current network doesn't have the answer, or do you feel like usually the founders you've already met in the past have the answer that you're looking for?
I actually had this that experience recently where it felt like my personal network didn't have the answers. Sorry, it's like super hot in my
No
apartment.
worries.
Where when we were raising the Series A, and I was trying to talk to people who had gone through that process, and I realized like I only have like two like good friends who have gone through that process, right? And one of them had just gone through it a few weeks before me.
Hmm.
So I made much more of a conscious effort after closing the Series A to like find and connect with other like-minded founders who were much later stage, right? Who either sold their company or raised like a Series D or an E or whatever, um, who can sort of look back and advise based on what they wish they knew at the stage that I'm at. So I think yes, there was a point when I felt a little constrained, but I think now that network has grown, and there are a lot of people here who can provide insight and answers.
How'd you find those people?
Uh, Requesting intros from other people. I think like when you're first starting out, it's like it's really hard to get connected to people because your initial network is so small, right? Unless you're already coming from the tech community. So like the first time an investor connected with us, I was like, oh shit, we this is an investor meeting. We're probably only gonna get one. Like let's make sure to not drop the ball, right? But then as your network grows, it's like it's really easy to get connected to investors all of a sudden, right? And so I think it's like that with most things. Like now, our network of advisors and investors is big enough that uh, if I don't know someone who knows something, one of them definitely does, and they can connect us, right? So every time we're hiring for a new important role now, right, like our head of product, head of engineering, head of talent acquisition, I'll just ask our investors, hey, can you connect me to either a founder who did a great job hiring their head of talent, or this really exceptional head of talent, and I'll just ask them about like, how should I think about this role? How do I find the right person? And that process has worked really well for us.
You mentioned advisors. Do you have like formal advisory roles in your company, or are they more like an informal thing based on like your networks, or how do you view um, like that domain?
Yeah, we've it's a mix of both, right? So we have a lot of sort of informal advisors. We have investors that are former operators, right? Former founders that will advise us
Hmm.
as they're invested already. And then we have a few people that we've actually compensated um, as sort of formal advisors.
Compensated in equity?
Yeah, equity.
Gotcha. Okay. And then in terms of when you look to hire people, like do you have specific traits that you look for, certain values that you're looking for in the hiring process?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we started, my co-founder and I did this exercise. His personality is totally different from mine, right? And we basically try to figure out what are the like 3 or 4 traits that we have in common, like deep values that we have in common, that we think are also like the reasons for our success, right? And let's build a company full of people that share those same 3 or 4 values, right? Even if they're totally different, or particularly if they're totally different in every other way, right? In terms of background, appearance, politics, perspectives. We want them to be very, very diverse, but in these handful of ways, we want them to be the same.
Hmm.
And where we landed is like, we want people who are highly tenacious, right? Who just don't give up in the face of adversity. People who are uh, very curious, right? Who like learning for the sake of learning. People who are empathetic, right? To their coworkers, to the customers, to the people they meet. People who value transparency, right? In terms of being authentic with yourself and with other people, and people who can put the team over their self, right? Who
Hmm.
see that like the best way to achieve personal success is by being part of a team that is very, very successful, right? And so we've worked really hard to structure our recruiting process in such a way that we are bringing on people who share those same 5 values. And I think so far we've actually done a really great job of that.
Are there certain questions you'll ask to, I guess, see elements or signals in those dimensions?
Yeah. Like for example, on in terms of like tenacity, we'll ask about what is something that you've failed at many times before ultimately succeeding, right? And what we're looking for is that it's not just because if you ask like what's the hardest thing you've ever done, like a lot of people have done really hard things and they've just knocked it out on the first try, right? Some people are just really, really talented, and that's awesome. We want really talented people, but we also want people who can get knocked down like over and over and over again and then still succeed, right? And so I think that question really gets to that trait over there.
And then what about the other traits?
With curiosity, I'll sometimes ask. I think I got this one from, I don't know who, some famous CEO suggested this question, but it's what is something important that you've changed your mind about recently, right? And what we're looking for is mental flexibility, right? It's not people who like think they have the right answer and then they've got all the right answers, they don't need to change it. It's like people who are like constantly looking to learn and who can take those new learnings and use it to change core opinions that they have about things.
That is a cool one. I'll also see where that one comes from.
Yeah, it might be Jeff Bezos, but don't quote me on it.
Do you have a favorite CEO that you look up to, or just a general person you look up to in general from your current vantage point?
I mean, that's a tough one. Jeff Bezos and Amazon's got to be like the greatest product of all time. I know everyone hates him right now, but I've like everything in my house is from Amazon.
Me too.
So like the furniture, the food I eat, all of it comes from Amazon. So I would be like totally screwed if that product didn't exist. It's the kind of thing where, I was joking with when the vaccine rollout started, like, oh, too bad Jeff Bezos couldn't do the vaccine rollout, right? And like you immediately know what I'm talking about. Like, yeah, like whatever you think about him, if he had done the vaccine rollout, everyone would have got vaccinated right away. Like he's really on top of that stuff. So I'd probably say him.
Are there certain traits from the way he leaves Amazon that you would like to, I guess, develop in yourself or see in yourself already?
I don't know. That's a tough one, right? Because I'm really impressed with Amazon, with what he's built, but I don't know that I would want our company to look like Amazon, right? Okay. Like I think there are the culture he's built there works really well for what he's trying to do, which is basically deliver like the lowest cost product to everyone all the time, right? And so if you're doing that, you have to shave pennies from everywhere you can, and you work as hard as possible. And so he's built a culture that achieves what he's trying to do with Amazon. I don't think that's the kind of culture that I would want to build or work for, and I don't think it's necessary for the kind of company we're building. So there's, I think there's specific things that I would take from him, but yeah, I wouldn't want to just straight up emulate him.
And do you have a favorite book as it relates to you learning everything that it takes to, I guess, run your current company?
Yeah, The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz.
That is on my to-read list, but if you're to give a reason for our viewers to watch, what would you say is the top reason to read the book?
If you have any interest in starting a company, I think it's the best thing I've read in terms of like how to be a startup CEO, right? Because there's so many like crazy situations you go through that you can't really ask your like friends and family for advice because they've never had to navigate a situation like this, and they seem very stressful and they're really hard, and that's because like you said, that's because they're hard, right? These are hard decisions. It's not like there's an easy way out, but he gives you a framework for how to think about it, and I've found it totally invaluable. It's probably like, in the last like 5 years, it's probably the book I've read the most times, maybe like 3 or 4 times.
And then the second to last question I have is, do you have any advice you'd give to early stage founders or soon to be founders as it relates to things that you've personally learned?
I think we've covered some of it, right? Like, building out the model to test the idea, sort of how it scales ahead of time. I think like being really careful about picking your co-founder, right? Like we made, over the course of those first few years, we made like almost every mistake in the book, right? And we've been able to learn from that. But I think one thing that we got really, really well was just making sure that we worked with each other, right? Like finding a co-founder that you can absolutely trust. Um, and I've seen so many of my friends who are, maybe way smarter or like way harder working just get totally screwed because they didn't have a great co-founder relationship, right? And it's just like the starting a company puts so much stress on that relationship that you really need to have something solid in order to be able to get through that and be able to like count on each other to continue to build the company.
Do you have like a test that you like give to people to see if they're like quote unquote like ready to be or like a good fit as co-founders? Like how do you know when the trust level is sufficiently built?
Yeah, I don't know. See, we got really lucky. I've known Shawn for like 15 years, right? We've been through like lots of crazy stuff before we started the company. And I knew if that stuff didn't, put us over the edge, like probably nothing will. I think it would be really hard for me if I didn't know Shawn, it would be really hard for me to just like find someone and start a company with them. It has been done, right? I think the Lyft founders met each other for the purposes of starting Lyft or something like that. And obviously the company has turned out really well, but I think there are way more horror stories than success stories there. So to the extent that you're, it might be just like investing in your friends' friendships, right? Like making sure you take care of those relationships because the people that you knew in high school and college, like that's a really good pool of talent for someone that you can like really trust and build a company with.
Well, I've enjoyed this past hour and I should be respectful of your time. So I like to ask all of my guests the same question as the final one. For all of our viewers who are trying to or would like to follow along your journey or reach out to you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
Uh, Best way to reach me is by email. So that's b@axlepayments.com. So just the letter B at Axle is AXLE, payments with an S at the end.com.
Sounds good. Well, thanks again for your time.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much, man. I appreciate it.